My name is Dan Glass, and I'm a master's student at SUNY New Paltz, second-year master's student in the psychology department. So I'm interested in evolutionary psych. I work with Glenn Gare, and my particular area of interest is clinical psychology from an evolutionary perspective. So, and this is how I got involved in AEPS, because somebody pointed me to AEPS and said these people are doing this. In order to understand how you would apply evolution in a practical setting, or clinical setting, you have to know a little bit about how evolution is applied to clinical psych, at least in the research domain. So I'm going to start with that half of things, and then Nick Armenti is going to pick up with a little bit about what an applied evolutionary practitioner who's interested in clinical work would do. So you've all had time to see this cartoon, I guess. So I'm going to a bunch of different items here. But so let's start with the history of the evolutionary approach to clinical psych. It really started with Darwin. As soon as evolution was around, Darwin had this interest in mental illness just because he was an intellectual, was interested in a lot of things. He was interested in the plight of the mentally ill. He was a progressive. I mean, if certainly by those standards. Even today, he was a progressive. He was interested in asylum reform, these type of things. But his real contribution to the current field of evolutionary clinical approaches was his work on the normal functions of emotion. So there's this guy that's, in the original, like, the Duchenne literature, who's somewhat of a contemporary, these studies of emotion, of what the facial expressions are for, what the emotions are for. The normal function of emotions has been sort of the thing that Darwin contributed most to the modern field. And of course, you may know that Freud was very interested in Darwinian thinking, and a lot of his sort of, I hate to call it theory, a lot of Freudian thought was based in evolution. This is very little of it has made its way into the modern field of evolutionary psychology. Jung as well, and Jung was actually, some of his Jungian thought, whether or not you know it, is actually similar to evolutionary psychology on a superficial level, and also sort of if you look at some of the main themes he was describing. But this is just a little bit about the pre-modern evolutionary clinical approaches. I just want to say that in general, evolutionary clinical research is extraordinarily new, aside from this. And so it's really hard to find people who are doing this systematically as their main area of research, right? So with that in mind, I'll tell you about some of the different lines of historical research that sort of are in this field. And the first one in the real modern sphere was what was called at the time, this was like the 70s, ethological psychiatry was the first real attempt to apply evolutionary thinking to the realm of psychiatry or clinical psychology. So this was the book that sort of, I guess, the main statement of that movement, called ethological psychiatry. And the idea was you take ethology, which is the study of natural animal behavior, and evolution is implicit in ethology, and you look at humans from the same way in a clinical setting. So the idea is that so this was new at the time, right? This is what we all do now implicitly, but this was new at the time. Let's look at the human in the psychiatrist's office as an animal, all right? So he or she is related to other animals. Therefore, you can look at the human behavior in the same way that you can look at animal behavior. So they looked at animal models of clinical disorders, right? So you look at what animals do when they're anxious. You could see these stereotypies with these sort of fixed action patterns that an animal might have. Let's say like a pecking behavior that a bird would have. You notice that the pecking behavior is exacerbated when you trap the bird, or when the bird is anxious, it begins to peck at nothing, or it will pluck out its own feathers. So this was the idea of, maybe we can use this ethological approach to look at psychiatry. And I have this book, and it's great because it's the first statement. It's a little bit dry by today's standards. You find it, I think, on Amazon. And there are all different people talk about how you can apply this approach. I think that okay. So sociobiology had just begun too at the time. So a couple of researchers contributed to this book, as well as an edited volume. So they talked about sociobiology, the perspective of sociobiology, including kin selection, reciprocal altruism, all these things could also be fall into this category of ethological psychiatry. So animal models of psychopathology are still around. This term is not really in use anymore. This is sort of being subsumed by this new field. You know what? All right. As we delete these PowerPoints off the desktop, this will stop happening. So they talked about what would this actually look like. There was a little section in the book, and so the idea in ethology is you observe the animal as natural habitat. So these people back in the late 70s said this is what ethological psychiatry would look like. You would observe a natural human behavior. So instead of just talking in the office and just listening to what the person is saying, you would also place emphasis on their observed behaviors, their natural, what they naturally do. The natural function of behaviors as well is something that now we all think about that in this conference, but this is something that was new at the time. You think, well, anxiety, aggression, like this dog here. I mean, this is a natural thing that people have. We have aggression, and aggression has a function. It's not just something the devil created to make us fight with each other. This is something that there's an actual basis for a lot of the jealousy. So these were all okay. So the rejection of the blank slate model of the human mind, the fact that we do have these tendencies. And of course, the multidimensional causes of behavior, the reaction, they were reacting to the psychiatry at the time, which was placed a lot of emphasis on I would say the social environmental type of approach was then sort of okay. So what is it? I guess this is the approach that's still going on. I mean, what is it like for you? Let's look at your social surroundings. These people also say, well, you should look at the physiological sort of milieu. You should look at the genetics, the physical environmental interaction. So this was ethological psychiatry, right? So I would say that we still have this approach under a different name. So let's move on to. I guess we're hopping ahead to the current day here for a second. When we talk about evolutionary approaches to clinical psychology, a lot of people will immediately think of adaptationist perspectives. So when I talk about some people, they'll say, well, okay, so you're talking about that mental disorder is evolved for a reason. And I would say, well, that's not the entirety. In fact, there might be even a small portion of what I would consider to be evolutionary clinical psychiatry or psychology. But there are these approaches, so I think we should talk about them, the adaptationist perspectives of mental illness. This is other line of thinking within evolutionary clinical approaches. So the researchers, they'll posit an adaptive explanation for a phenomenon, a clinical phenomenon, like a depression, schizophrenia, and I would say that there's a strong and a weak form of this claim. So the strong form would be this mental illness, as it exists now, evolved for a particular function. And so it is a natural thing that we have. And there was a paper, I don't remember her first name, Sherman, a couple of papers about, she suggested bipolar disorder, as it exists, is as an adaptation to cold climates. So I guess particular population who lived in these climates, in, I guess, the Scandinavian north, where there's the long winters that are dark, and then so this sort of, okay, I think you see where this is going. This was an adaptive explanation that I would say is a strong argument for adaptation. And depression is another one that's a lot in the literature now, that depression might actually, in certain cases, be an adaptive response to certain social or, I guess, environmental triggers. All right, so this is the stuff of strong adaptive argument. There's also what I call the weak adaptive argument, which is not pejorative on how conclusive it is, but the argument that some form of this phenomenon was an adapted mechanism, but the current clinical manifestation represents a dysfunction of that. So OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, has been proposed. There's different domains of different types of symptoms, and it's been proposed that when you have a disinhibition or a problem with the brain, a lesion, some sort of environmental cause, then it creates a dysfunction in this naturally adapted system. So these are the two different forms of adaptive claims that you'll find in the literature. So treatment implications are interesting. I mean, so what do you do? So therefore, so it's an adaptation. What if it's a strong adaptation? If it's depression, and it turns out that depression turns out to be something that's normal, what do you do? Okay, so considering the context and the function is important here, because somebody, instead of giving them drugs, maybe you change their lifestyle. You at least ask them to examine their lifestyle. I think next time I'm going to get more into these treatment implications here. But there's this issue of, okay, so still, if they're in pain, you treat their symptoms regardless, because the goal of clinical psychology is to get people out of pain. So you don't just tell someone, well, it's normal, go home. I mean, these are open questions in the field. So obviously there are problems with adaptations with respect to mental illness, because mental illness, for the most part, not always. I mean, it seems to be on the surface a problem for your fitness, right? For your reproductive capacity. So it's of course the case that other forces besides adaptation can lead to evolutionary outcomes of any type. And Keller and Miller have, Jeffrey Miller, that is, and Matthew Keller have this phrase: how do we explain mental disorders which are common, harmful, and heritable? Right. So they're net. They seem to be net fitness disadvantage genes here, and they're common and they're heritable. How do we explain that? So here's what they said. Here's one way to explain it: is balancing selection, and adaptation's perspective would be a kind of balancing selection in certain cases. So balancing selection says that you have a gene that can be problematic in one respect, but is maintained for some other reason. So here's some examples. Heterozygote advantage is when, if you're a heterozygote for a certain gene, you do better than if you're a homozygote for these other alleles in certain environments. So the classical one is sickle cell anemia. So if you don't have sickle cell anemia in this one particular gene, this locus, you're fine. If you have two of this allele, then you have sickle cell anemia. But if you have one, it turns out you have a resistance to malaria, and so you look at the map, and it turns out malarial areas are the same areas where this particular gene arose in evolutionary time. So these are tropical areas that have mosquitoes, and interestingly enough, this type of disease has arisen more than once in evolutionary time in different areas, different parts of the world. I think thalassemia is a different one, which seems to have the same type of effect. So that's a heterozygote advantage. So people who are resistant to malaria, who are heterozygotes, have children who can then have the disease. All right, that's one type of way that you can maintain a deleterious gene. All right, so antagonistic pleiotropy or pleiotropy, depending on your pronunciation, is the gene does a good thing and a bad thing in the same person, right? So, and something that leaps to mind would be if you say schizophrenia can. This is just a hypothesis that's been put forward. It's not something I necessarily endorse. Schizophrenia can increase your mating odds because you're creative, and so therefore you have more mating opportunities. Of course, then you also might go into these periods of problematic, withdrawal or low reproductive area. So this is antagonistic pleiotropy, frequency-dependent selection. I'm not going to go into all these, but these are types of balancing selection explanations of why we have mental disorder that have been put forward. Spatiotemporal variation is the same thing as mismatch, which means it used to work in a past environment, it doesn't now. Okay, so this is the explanation that Keller and Miller put forward as to why there are mental disorders, some mental disorders, common heritable harmful mental disorders. They call it mutation selection balance. What this is means that mutations accrue faster than they're naturally selected against sometimes. Okay, so you have a mutation. If it's bad, if it's very, very bad or lethal, it gets weeded out of the gene pool. They say that they propose that in the brain, because it's such a complex organ, the genes that translate into human behavior you can have a mutation that's so small that it doesn't really do much in and of itself. So sort of invisible to natural selection. However, if they combine in the right combinations in a particular person, in a particular scenario, with particular stressors, then it can result in mental illness, right? So everybody carries this mutation load of minor mutations, and so under this disorder, under this model, some disorders are they're just going to happen, and they don't look like adaptations to Keller and Miller. They say these just look like more like you have these mutation load, and you have a 1 to 2% prevalence rate in these disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar, obsessive compulsive disorder. They say that some disorders do look like they still could be adaptations. They didn't propose that every mental disorder that is treated in the clinic today is necessarily this type of problem. They say depression, because of its high prevalence rates, might look more like an adaptation, perhaps. So what is this? The mutation selection balance? What are the implications of this? It's sort of depressing. I mean, in some sense, the way they've written the paper. I mean, okay, so what can you do? Mental illness is inevitable. We all have mutation loads. Now, it's so complex. It's so multifactorial. How the hell can you do anything about it? Is it this model of, okay, so we all have some, so what is your disease? What is your set of diseases? Oh, well, I have, OCD risk. I mean, this is sort of a naive reading of this type of literature. You have to take more drugs now, everyone. So, this is the type of thing that a lot of evolutionary researchers who try to posit adaptive explanations don't want to hear, because mutation selection balance sort of makes things tough for them. However, I mean, this then it becomes a sort of a matter of what the geneticists help out here. Genomic sequencing may hold the answers to figuring out a lot of these type of questions about mental disorders. Basically, it's still an open avenue. It's just something that I like to talk about whenever we talk about adaptive explanations to mental illness. The fact that it may not be adaptive, and you may still be in the gene pool. And then, so here's everything else, right? Every other evolutionary approach that you could think of, that you could apply to mental illness, that any sort of evolutionary model falls under the category of evolutionary clinical psychology. You don't have to say it's an adaptation. You don't have to appeal to sort of a phylogenetic model. And I would like, I guess Nick is going to talk more about some particular brands of that, but I just want to say that any model that looks at the evolved history of the brain and says, and asks the question of ultimately why do we have mental disorder and why does it manifest the way it does, is an evolutionary approach, and that really interests me. So I'm doing research on obsessive compulsive disorder, the fact that there are, I'm going to present on it later, maybe I shouldn't spoil the surprise, but the idea is that there are different domains of functioning that are discretely impaired in obsessive compulsive disorder, and you may be able to look at that in a sort of evolutionary modular sense even. There's the Jeffrey Miller and Glenn Gare, Scott Barry Kaufman, I think, has done a little bit of this. Have looked at the intersection of mental disorders and mating intelligence. I guess this was in Glenn and Scott's new book. There's going to be a chapter about the intersection of mating intelligence and mental disorders. How this can be sort of an honest signaler that you have poor quality genes. I believe is a simplified version of some of these arguments. And the whole field of developmental psychology, psychopathology, right? Especially there's evolutionary developmental psychopathology, which is this integrated approach which looks at over the lifespan. What are the factors that are involved in mental disorder, and how do genes play a role? The evolutionary, if you add evolutionary to this, you end up with this great big picture type of approach. So this is just one more approach that I like. This is called Darwin in the Madhouse, this paper, and the idea was that you would look at evolutionary clinical psychology. One way to do it is to look at sort of information processing model of mental illness, which appeals to me from the OCD perspective. Come on Sunday, I'll show you how. But the idea, so what they propose here is that these are information processing modules in the brain, right? So this does one thing, this does another. Okay, and this one is upstream from these. So the idea is that information in the brain travels through many of these type of things where this is here, and then there's a information output to these, right? So their argument is that what they would like people who study this to keep in mind is that you could have some sort of lesion or insult or environmentally triggered insult here, right, in this upstream module, and then which then provides problematic output to all the downstream modules, which then result in problematic output symptom clusters. So the idea is that these modules could be properly functioning. These don't have to be impaired in and of themselves. So I guess it's sort of it involves sort of a cognitive, neurocognitive approach to understanding evolutionary psychology. This is just one example of a type of evolutionary clinical psychology approach that I think could be promising to, if we're going to explain how a lot of mental disorders, how they manifest themselves, and why and how mental disorder exists. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Nick.